Hi everyone, this is Josh from Narrate. Last year, Narrate held a conversation titled, Hello, My Name is Anxiety. Narrate went back to that series this past weekend with a talk titled, The Truth About Risk. Enjoy!
Hey, good morning. It's really fantastic to be back with you. Thanks for the warm reception you gave Dr. Bruner last weekend. That was sure a treat for me to have the great prof from George Fox here, and he actually spent a bunch of the weekend with us and went to baseball games with us and hung out. And based upon your review and the feedback I've got, I think I need to resign and we should just hire him. I think that's how all that went. So glad that you enjoyed him. So I was in town, got to be a part of my boys' tournaments, and then also got to come listen to him at the 10. It was funny, though. So Saturday night, my 11-year-old Chase was in the first round of bracket play, and it was a tight game, you might say. And I might have been standing behind the backstop, and there might have been a couple calls that weren't very good, and I might have said something, because it's so hard to not be that guy. Anyway, I didn't think much of it. I'm just being me, and we're walking back to the car after the game, and because he was standing back there too, which we won the game, by the way. That's really the important detail, right? And the bad call didn't cost us the game either, by the way. Anyway, we were walking back to the car, and he said, Adam, it's a good thing I'm preaching tomorrow because you'd have to go to confession before you preach. Oh, I really am that guy, aren't I? So what I want to do this morning is, before we start a brand new series that we're going to call Baggage here in a couple weeks, I want to reach back into the series we did last summer. In June and July, we did this series called Hello, My Name is Anxiety, and you can grab those podcasts and some of the literature there. But we did that series because what we observed is that anxiety is a pervasive issue, that it's kind of an everyday word that we use, and 20 years ago it wasn't even in our lexicon, and yet many of our experiences with anxiety are very real, very sincere, and sometimes crippling. And so last year we did this series where a lot of it was me going like, okay, here's my struggle with anxiety, which has been lifelong, but I've only understood in the last few years, and here's some of the tools I've used, and here's what science says, and here's what Scripture says. So what I want to do this morning is in some way just make sure that we're kind of paying attention to it, like kind of a one-year check-in, but only no latex gloves involved, I promise, especially if you're 50. But what I want to do is just kind of go like, we need to keep this conversation front and center, and how are we doing with this? How are we doing with fear? How are we doing with the management of this thing called anxiety? And one way to do that, I think, because here's what I do. My antennae are kind of up, and I'm just kind of constantly paying attention to stuff that might be relevant to me as I read and I listen, because my struggle is real. And I left, really the summary of last year's study for me, and what I suggested to you was that anxiety is not a problem to be managed. It's not a problem to be solved. Like, it's not going away. It's an emotional reality to manage. And so in my efforts to manage it, in our efforts, I'm constantly learning. And so this morning I just kind of want to back up a dump truck and go, here's a bunch of stuff that I've learned in the last year. And a great way to start all that would be to talk about a book written by a guy named Adam Grant called Originals. Now, some of you may recognize that name because he also wrote a book called Give and Take, and we plagiarized a whole series from that. Originals is one of those books where you go, that should have been a pamphlet, because the first couple chapters are awesome, and then you're like, yeah. So maybe that's offensive to him. But in there, it's probably actually very offensive to him, isn't it? Maybe before we get sued for plagiarism, we should strike that from the podcast. In there, he makes some observations about risk and fear that I think lead to some important questions that I think can serve as jumping off points. And really those questions are, what value is risk? And what is a normal person, though we could probably all agree there's no such thing, what is a normal person's experience of fear? What's it going to look like? And part of what his research brought to the surface for me was, and maybe the way that we could ask it is this way, is when you think about people who do great things with their lives and start businesses and manage careers and change the world, or even more locally, people who suddenly you're looking at and they're in their 60s and you just so admire the life that they live or the parents that they are or those types of things. When you think of the great ones who accomplish great things, what assumptions do you make about their experience of fear and anxiety? Because it seems to me that if you're anything like me, one of the assumptions is that we assume that there are these kind of balls to the wall, I don't even know what risk is, I just go for it. Now, if that's offensive, let me back up. Because I did some research on that phrase this week, because it was one of those like, wait a minute, can I say that at church? So I Googled it. Here's the good news. Balls to the wall is not sexual at all. Actually, balls to the wall is it's an aviator's term. Because it would seem that for years, the throttle of an airplane was on the floor, of course, still is, and it had a ball on the top. And to say balls to the wall was push the thing into the firewall and go full speed. So next time you use it in class and you get in trouble, you say, no, I'm not cussing, I'm an aviator. So the question that I want to ask, though, is, are those people who you respect, are they fearless? And is that a correct assumption? Because, see, here's what I do, is I like to think that they are, because then I can justify not doing those things because I experience fear and I calculate risk in a way they don't. And therefore, I get an out because they're too dumb to understand that there's actually a risk involved, right? Or maybe too brave to actually care. But here's where this gets interesting, and this is where I'm really indebted to Adam Grant's research. He would point out, first of all, that it's easy to look at what we call the United States and assume that the Declaration of Independence and really the Revolutionary War was inevitable, that it was bound to happen. But when you look closer at the facts, and especially the people involved, what you see are people who were very reticent to get involved, people who had opportunity to get involved and refused to get involved because they were afraid of the implications. John Adams. When the ideas about a revolution and a Declaration of Independence were first coming up, John Adams was a logical target to help lead the movement, and he wanted nothing to do with it because he was a young, budding attorney making a good living, enjoying his life, and he understood that there was going to be backlash from England, and so he resisted at all costs. Eventually, he was named a delegate for the Continental Congress, and so he obliged. One of the first things he did was drag another person into it who had also been resisting for years. You may have heard of him. He liked to stand on the bow of a boat, which isn't even possible, but his name was George Washington. Can you picture that picture where he's like, wait a minute, I think you would sink. But nonetheless, George Washington had every invitation, wanted nothing to do with it. He had his own business. He loved his life. He said, no, no, no. But his buddy, John Adams, actually elected him to be the commander-in-chief of the army, and so he did. And then he said this. Go ahead, next slide. I have tried every endeavor in my power to avoid it. He wanted nothing to do with it. Martin Luther King Jr., we rightly think of him as one of the most influential people in American history. That speech on the Washington Mall, among the most important moments in American history. He used to be terrified of speaking publicly. In fact, in 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus. She was eventually tried for doing so. The result of that trial was a bunch of people in Montgomery, Alabama, formed the Montgomery Improvement Association. The first thing they did was name Martin Luther King Jr. as their president. He knew that came with a speech, and his emotional response, he would later say, was this: I became possessed by fear. It gets even more ironic than that. 3 weeks prior to this, he and his wife had kind of had a coming together moment. He had just finished his theses in school. They had agreed that his lifelong dream was to be the president of a college and a local church pastor. They agreed 3 weeks prior that he would not accept any invitations for community involvement going forward. It was a distraction to his work. He was like, we're not doing it anymore. And then this happened. Michelangelo, unless you're pretentious, and then it's Michelangelo, because I've been to Rome. I like to think of him as a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle who preferred nunchucks, right? When he was first asked to paint a fresco, not a fresca, I had to look that up too. That's the original diet soda they still make, but doesn't taste any good. Fresco is a painting on plaster in the Sistine Chapel. When he was first invited by the Pope to do that, which is now this remarkable piece of art, some of the best in human history, he was so afraid of doing so because he was a sculptor, not a painter. He moved. He fled to Florence for 2 years, and his only explanation for why was because I'm not going to do that. For years, decades really, astronomy languished because one of its most important figures refused to publish his findings. Copernicus, when he first discovered that it turns out the earth revolves around the sun, not vice versa, he was so aware of the implications of his findings that he sat on it. For 25 years, he refused to publish his work. Not because he thought it was wrong, but because he knew it was right, and he knew that the backlash, especially from Christ followers, was going to be horrific. 25 years in, a prominent Catholic cardinal became aware of his work, begged him to publish it, encouraged him to publish it. He didn't. 29 years after Copernicus' discovery, say that word 5 times fast, 29 years later, it was finally published against his will. He didn't even publish it. A young mathematics professor became aware of the work and thought the work was more important than his desires and published it against his will. In 1977, Steve Jobs and the other Steve, who's lesser known but has great facial hair, Steve Wozniak, I think I say that because the only thing I can grow is a Hooterite beard, like crazy, that's not offensive, but a crazy neck beard, nothing up here. So, sorry if that's offensive to you, but we probably have facial hair issues. So in 1977, they completed the construction of the first Mac computer. They thought they were onto something. They found an angel investor who would give them $250,000. Now, I don't know how old you were. I was -1 in 1977. $250,000. There was one caveat, and the deal almost blew up because it became such a big deal. The caveat, the facial hair Steve, Wozniak Steve, he had to quit his day job with HP Computers. He wasn't willing to do so because he wasn't sure that Apple actually had a future to it. But he eventually did. Here's what he actually said. He said, my psychological block was that I didn't want to start a company, because I was just afraid. My point is simply this. You can look at guys like that and go, oh, geez, yeah, what kind of fear must you have had? Apple Computers, are you kidding me? There was no fear. There was no risk. And in reality, there was. And here I think is the risk. That what's easy to see is a guy performing at a high level in business, in life, in marriage, in relationship, in athletics, a woman performing at a high level, and we assume they're cut from a different cloth than we are. My question is, what if that's not accurate? We can go ahead to that next slide. There's another one. Phil Knight, the man with very bad bangs. Go ahead to that next slide. You know what year Phil Knight started selling tennis shoes? He was a former track star himself. You know what year he started selling tennis shoes out of the trunk of his car? 1964. I was -18, 14 at that point. I don't know why that matters. Guess what year Phil Knight quit his day job as a CPA? 1969. So for 5 years, he's like, I don't know that there's a future in this Nike thing. I think I'll keep my day job. Do you think he was dealing with fear and anxiety and the things that we're petrified of? The founders of Google, this one, if you think of yourself as having missed opportunities, this one will top the cake, especially if you were like in your 30s. The founders of Google, in 1996, they discovered or found this way to optimize searching on the internet. In 1996, they were enrolled as graduate students at Stanford. By 1997, they became convinced that their idea was a distraction from their studies, which to me is its own commentary on the way we think about education now, because it's like, why do you go to college? So I can make myself employable and serve people with a vocation and make money. They were thinking, I think we better sell off Google because it's distracting us from our studies, which I think is ironic. Maybe I'm showing my bent a little bit. So they decided they were going to sell their idea. They were asking, in 1997, you could have bought Google for $2 million. Nobody would buy it. So in 1998, they were like, okay, I think there's a future in this, and they dropped out of school, and now it's worth, $500 billion. We see this narrative. Listen, part of what convinces me that the narrative of the Scripture is so reliable and so true, because if you were making it up, it wouldn't have so many flaws. Consider Esther. We see these stories in the Bible. Esther's a great one of these in my view. Now, if you're not familiar with the story, maybe you're someone who's just getting into this life of kind of centering yourself around the Scriptures and starting your day reading the text. Esther would be a great place to start, and you can read it over and over and over, and I guarantee the Holy Spirit's going to just kind of park you on some major awesome aspects of the narrative. But here's the story just as a way of a kind of a quick review or a quick introduction. Esther won what was really a Miss Medes and Persia beauty contest, which resulted in her being invited into the harem of a king. She became one of many brides that this foreign king had. She was Jewish. One of the king's primary right-hand people didn't like Jewish people. He was working on a plan to kill all the Jewish people. And so Esther's uncle, Mordecai, sent a messenger to Esther to say to Esther, hey, Esther, the king's your husband. Would you go talk to him and ask him to please spare the Jewish people? Listen to what Esther said to Mordecai in response. Verse 10 of chapter 4. Then she, this is Esther, instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law. And Alice in Wonderland says, off with their heads. That's the law. Go ahead, next slide. That they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. Watch this verse. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see what she's saying there. Listen, first of all, it's a capital offense to approach the king without being asked. You don't just get the president's email. That doesn't work that way. And second of all, by the way, Mordecai, he has lots of wives, and he hasn't summoned me for 30 days. Parenthetically, there's not much going on there, Mordecai. He's not infatuated with me right now. I haven't even been invited to the chambers for a while. She sends the message back. Mordecai hears that. Being the persistent, annoying uncle that all of us need at times, he says this, and who knows, Esther, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. What's he doing? He's calling her out. He's going, wait a minute. What's going on here is you're afraid, and sometimes you have to face those feelings. I love the way Andy Stanley has said this for years. He says leadership is a stewardship. It's temporary, and you're accountable. He's calling her to push through that, not run from it. We know her, and here's my point. We know Esther as this incredible woman of God, and her story is so great and so inspiring, and if you're not careful, you think of her like you think about the founders of Google, and you go, I'll bet you they didn't even know what risk was. They were just these balls to the walls, like, what's risk? I don't care about anything. I'd jump off anything, do anything. It's not the story. The story is a woman who had to step into fear. Jeremiah, a prophet who, guys like Walt Brueggemann, who's one of the foremost Old Testament scholars today, would say he is among the most important characters in the Old Testament if we're to understand Jesus' kingdom of God vision. Jeremiah, that prophet, listen to the way his story started. In Jeremiah chapter 1, God comes to him and says this, the word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as the prophet to the nations. I mean, how's that for a silver spoon? Come on, you're Michael Jordan's son. Of course you're good at basketball. Even that's not enough, and that's probably not fair either. Verse 6, alas, sovereign Lord, I do not know how to speak. I'm too young. And listen, God just is like, yeah, I think we're putting a mask on something here. Listen to the next one. Then but the Lord said to me, do not say I am too young. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Watch verse 8. Do not be afraid of them. He's like, who said anything about being afraid? Let's just talk about, ouch, I just bit my lip. Let's just talk about what's really going on here. You are afraid. And it's holding you back. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. Or how about the disciples? Those 12 men, and I like to think that there was this unnamed group of women who were kind of unofficially a part of that crew, who we correctly celebrate as some of the greatest revolutionaries in world history. What we forget is it wasn't all daisies and roses and easy and like, what's fear and I'm not afraid of anything. Listen, Jesus was arrested. Probably most of you knew that when you walked in the door. If not, I just ruined the story for you. Jesus was arrested. Listen to verse 50. This is the first thing that Mark, the gospel writer Mark, says after Jesus was arrested. Then everyone deserted him and fled. It's been good. Thanks for the bread. Check you later. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. We think this was probably the author, John. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. So it's like, well, I could either get caught or I could run through town naked. I think I'm going with B. Talk about fear, right? Here's my point. So if we can break down this false narrative that says your grandpa, who was a World War II vet, who you have so much respect for, your dad, who was such a phenomenal father, and suddenly you don't think you can ever measure up, your mom, who stood in the gap so many times in these certain circumstances, and you think she's fearless, you think he's fearless. If we can break that narrative down and go, no. They had the same emotional experiences that all humans have. Then we can start asking this question, so okay, what do they do different? One guy, I think his name was Virgil or Larry or something Coombs. I couldn't find a picture of him, so we just went with his phrase, risk portfolio. He was a psychology professor at the University of Michigan. He coined the phrase risk portfolio, and this was helpful to me. What he observed was that successful stock market investors, those who like live to tell about it, like those who statistically make it the long haul in investing, and especially those investors who make high risk investments, what he observed is those people, the Warren Buffetts, what they actually do is they're you might call it hyper conservative in every area of their life, except for this one investment. That they're not balls to the wall, like, oh, I'll just throw money at every idea and hopefully some will work out. No, what he found is that people in the stock market who succeed over a lifetime, they actually get hyper-conservative in every area but one. He called it so then he drew a parallel to that in the way healthy people manage fear and anxiety. That in the business realm, what they find is that those people who actually just, what's fear and just kind of go for it, they actually don't succeed in leadership, in civil duties. They don't actually succeed. In fact, the statistics are, and this is what he gets into in the book Originals, people who keep their day job while pursuing their dream job are 30% more likely to be successful than those who just go for it. Actually, his analogy here is he said, it sounds weird, but he said, a person driving to the casino to put a whole bunch of money down on blackjack is actually likely to drive under the speed limit. Because that's how healthy people do this. Bill Gates becomes an example of this. We like to tell the story of Bill Gates, of this guy who had this idea and went for it and quit Harvard, and boom, look at him now. He's one of the wealthiest people in the world. What we miss is that Bill Gates had a year of software experience before he quit. What we miss is he didn't quit Harvard. He took a leave of absence, which is completely different than quitting. Leave of absence means I might come back with my tail between my legs. Will you still take me? Yes, we will. Thank you. He also asked his parents if they would financially support him while he went for it. Or how about Branch Rickey, the GM of the Brooklyn Dodgers that the St. Louis Cardinals first let get away? Check this out, Father's Day. Speaking of the St. Louis Cardinals. Sorry, that was nerdy. I wasn't planning on doing that. But Branch Rickey did start with the St. Louis Cardinals. Branch Rickey, this man, he's an American hero. He brought Jackie Robinson to the big leagues. And of course, you've probably seen the movie 42 and all the flack that both of them took for it. Branch Rickey wasn't this freewheeling risk taker. He was actually an incredibly conservative guy. He was the GM of a baseball team. He wouldn't go to the ballpark on Sundays because he was so serious about his faith. I was not trying to say anything because I go to the ballpark on Sundays all the time. He didn't cuss. He didn't drink. My only point is to see there's this false narrative that says, my mom's an incredible person, but she doesn't experience fear like I do. She does. She's just managed it. And I think the question we're really asking here when we ask this, and this is my bias when people ask me to go to coffee and talk about my own experience with anxiety, is I think the question we're asking is this: of what value is risk? And what's the role of fear? Or maybe we could say it this way: are we treating fear and anxiety and risk as problems to be solved? Or are we seeing them as lifelong emotional realities that healthy, thriving people have strategies for dealing with? You know, Dr. Bruner and I got to have dinner last Thursday night when he first got into town, and we talked a lot about this. This is kind of in his wheelhouse right now, too. He's grieving the loss of a wife, and he's experienced a lot of life. And I kept using the phrase, the negative emotion of anxiety. And finally he stopped me and he was like, why do you always attach that word negative to it? I was like, well, it is. Anger, anxiety, like they're negative emotions. He's like, or they're emotions, Adam. They're part of what it means to be human. It's the way God made us. And then he really pushed. He said, Adam, let me ask you this. What if grace says that you are loved and accepted by God even if you never get a handle on your anxiety? Even if you never find the gumption to step into fear? He was pushing and he was going, well, what happens if we normalize fear and understand it's part of what it means to be human? And here's my concern, and if you weren't with us in this series last summer, I don't want to be misunderstood here, but I do think, and this is what else we talked about, I do think we have to be cautious because we do live in a day, I'm going to argue, that does tell us anxiety and fear are abnormal. And if you want, we can give you a pill and you can get rid of them forever. That's not a commentary on meds, not in the least. We've referred so many people to psychiatrists and therapists. I'm not saying that at all. Please go hear the last summer's series if you think I am. But that being said, we do have to be cautious, don't we, about a culture that says, oh, fear, anxiety, nobody's supposed to experience that. That's abnormal. Let's get rid of that. What if the conversation is a God who goes, or we could learn what it means to be an emotional human and how to manage that one, much like sexuality and anger and any number of other emotions that we get to deal with as humans. In Joshua, this for me is one of my favorite places on this whole topic because I think it begs a very important question, and dare I say, a bit of a prophetic one in our culture. Joshua, the man called to lead Israel, which didn't exactly have a great track record of followership from the desert into the promised land. Listen to what God says to him on that eve. Be strong and courageous because you'll lead these people to inherit the land I swore to your ancestors to give them. Verse 7, be strong and very courageous, which looks really good on a coffee mug, but when you're petrified, it's like, here's the problem, God, I'm not, right? Listen to verse 9. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Question, is God here telling Joshua, and by extension us, that fear is an emotion that healthy people don't experience? Or is he saying to Joshua, don't be controlled by your fear? Now, I don't even think I can answer that question for you. I don't think it's my place to answer that question for you. I do think that as you deal with your own experience of fear and anxiety, the pointed question you have to deal with is it a problem to be solved? Let's be done with it. Or is it a reality to be managed? John Townsend, who's this great thinker that we've talked about in the past, he's written a book called The Entitlement Cure. In there, he makes the point that healthy, thriving people, they don't expect to get the championship game trophy until after they've won the championship game. And that healthy, thriving people, that they don't expect to get promoted until they've actually been successful in the job before that. And that healthy, thriving people, they don't grow up in environments where their parents say, here, eat your dessert first, because the vegetables will take care of themselves. What he does say is we have an issue with entitlement in our culture, and it partially explains our aversion for fear and risk. Listen to what he says. He says, an attitude of entitlement, though, tells us you can have it all. Do what is easy and comfortable first, and you'll be rewarded with a lot of amazing things. I had never, until reading that book, considered that part of my issues with anxiety and fear were actually entitlement issues. Because I want these great experiences with God, and I want impact, right? And you want to be known for being good at what you do. But you don't want the risk that comes with it. You don't want any discomfort. Like that shouldn't in any way make you emotionally uncomfortable or scared. You shouldn't have to risk anything. He goes on to point out that maybe it would do us well to remember that risk is actually an incredibly valuable tool in the human experience. And just to bullet point some things for you. Number one, he says, risk is your only hope for a better anything. And I have those on the mind maps on the heat registers if you want to take this with you. Risk, he said, is your only hope for a better anything. That by definition, without it, you get the same. More likely worse, but at best the same. Number two, he says that the process of risk brings out the best in you. Right? Because it forces you to obsess about the facts. It forces you to pay really close attention, to get really close to what's going on and make some really hard decisions. Number three, he said, risk humbles you because it takes you to the limit of yourself. Risk reminds you that you can get really, really invested in something, care deeply about it, feel called by God to do it, and have it still not be successful. We were walking off of a field in a tournament in May, and just kind of bummed. We didn't feel like we should be going home yet. And my friend Steve, who is this lifelong entrepreneur and leader, he looked at me and he knew how hard all of us had worked for as long as we had. And he looked at me and said, Adam, sometimes even average takes a lot of hard work. What is that? I think it's seasoned wisdom that understands what entitlement looks like and why it's so dangerous. Number four, he said, risk is a great teacher. That it teaches us things that we simply can't learn outside of it. And number five, that you feel more alive when you risk. In fact, his takeaway, and here's this renowned business coach and psychologist, here's his 2 bits of advice to people. He says that healthy, thriving people build a habit of taking one meaningful risk a week. And he actually suggests that for some of us, it might be good to open an Evernote or as kind of a diary something, or you don't have to tell it, you don't have to call it a diary if you're like, I don't do diary, whatever. But to actually track and challenge yourself to track risk. And to challenge yourself to once a week, sometimes do I take it or not could just be found in the like, well, it's meaningful, it might be helpful, it's a little scary, I haven't taken one yet this week, I guess this is the one. You know, last summer, and I asked his permission to share this story. Last summer, JR, my youngest, he made the 9U All-Star team. He'd never played All-Star baseball before, never played travel baseball before. We got to the first tournament, and we had a bunch of kids who were in that position. And the first tournament was actually, we were playing in a 10U bracket, so we're playing up, which doesn't sound like that big a deal, but when a 9-year-old's playing a 10-year-old and the 10-year-olds have some experience, it is a big deal. And there was a few kids on the team, one of them being JR, who it felt like every time he got up in the tournament would just stand there and watch. I'd be like, dude, swing the bat. Those are good pitches. And sometimes it was like, could I go back? He wouldn't swing. And he was frustrated. I was just kind of like, okay, so what do we do here? How do we help him with this? We processed through the weekend, and it wasn't every at-bat, but it sure felt like it. That following Monday, we came up with this idea, and it wasn't punitive, but we decided we were going to go to the cage, the batting cages, and I was going to throw to him, and I think we threw like 300 pitches. And the deal was every time he didn't swing at a strike, which was my arbitrary call, and I have a big strike zone, every time he didn't swing, we would both do 5 push-ups. And, I couldn't lift my arms above my head by the time we were done. But it was fun. And again, it wasn't punitive. We were leaving, and finally, I was like, so I don't understand. Like, what was going on? And I'll never forget, he looked, he's like, Dad, I would step in the batter's box in that tournament, and I couldn't feel my legs. Which, of course, you go, oh, so it was nerves, right? That's fairly typical and normal. And it raises this question, like, what if God is a God who calls us to live parts of life with numb legs? What if the highest win isn't always a sense of incredible security and comfort? What if God is bigger than that? I want to end with Psalm 23. This has been meaningful for me for years, and I think this might actually, we may kind of work through this like we did the Lord's Prayer a couple Easters ago, but listen to the first few verses of Psalm 23. It says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake." So far you're like, oh, wow, this following God thing is so easy and awesome, and he's there, and he takes care of you. It's like something you put on a coffee. Oh, it's so warm and comforting. And then listen to this. "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Here's what stands out to me. 2,500 years ago, I'm not a Bible scholar, maybe it was 3,000 years ago, a people wrote Psalm 23. To me, it's affirming to know that even then, dealing with, facing fear was a human reality. It was a part of what it meant to be human. And part of their life experience and experience with God was not of a God who protects them and shelters them from that, but goes, hey, oh, so you've got numb legs? Okay, let's do this together. Let's just take a step, because we don't run from this, we walk through this. It's not, I don't know what your experience with fear and anxiety is, but what happens? What happens if you make this radical, dare I call it, countercultural decision that the absence of fear and risk is not the highest end of your life? Every time I do a study in the Bible on idolatry, I come back to my idol, it's control. It's the desire to have comfort all the time and never fear. What happens if you make the decision that God is bigger than that? Or better yet, what if you make the decision that a life with God and the life of impact that comes with it is better than that? I'd like to pray, and Kate and the band are going to lead us through one song so you can just kind of reflect your way out of here. Lord, it's so easy and almost trite to stand up here and talk about fear and our experiences with risk, and what we all know is that's part of the struggle, is 99% of the time it's doable and we can picture it and we're willing to do it, and there's that 1%. Thanks, God, that you invented relationship and community and people who can walk with us in that. Thanks, God, that you are the triune God who is present, and especially present through your Spirit, that you can encourage us into that. Thanks, Jesus, that the life you represent isn't this simple, easy, what really amounts to an empty promise, but that you experienced everything life has to offer. You experienced it in spades, and now you offer to lead us through the same experience. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.